Canada is not reacting emotionally to Trump's decision to cut off Venezuelan oil shipments to Cuba. It is not issuing threats. It is not making dramatic announcements. Instead, Canada is doing what it does best in moments of global disruption. It is repositioning quietly, methodically, and with long-term leverage in mind. On January 11, 2026, just days after President Trump announced the complete cutoff of Venezuelan oil exports to Cuba and declared American control over Venezuela's petroleum flows, analysts at Valora Analytics issued a blunt assessment. Canada, they said, was about to gain leverage not just in Asia, but across the entire heavy crude market, including over the United States itself. While Cuba slid toward rolling blackouts and Venezuela's already fragile oil sector absorbed another shock, Canadian energy producers saw something very different. They saw a market imbalance forming in real time, a gap in heavy crude supply, and a rare moment where demand would outrun politics. Today, we are breaking down how Trump's Venezuela operation is doing far more than isolating Cuba. It is quietly reshaping global oil flows in a way that strengthens Canada's negotiating power with Asian refiners and weakens America's traditional control over heavy crude pricing. And it is happening faster than most people realize. Before we get into it, if you value calm, fact-based analysis that looks past headlines and focuses on consequences, consider liking the video and subscribing. This channel exists to explain what power shifts actually mean, not just what politicians say. So why does Canadian heavy crude suddenly matter more than ever? For decades, Canada and Venezuela occupied the same narrow corner of the global oil market. Both produced heavy, sulfur-rich crude that only specialized refineries could process efficiently. Both targeted the same buyers. And for years, Venezuela was the lower-cost option, especially for refineries along the US Gulf Coast. Before Trump's intervention, Venezuela was producing roughly 900,000 barrels per day. That was far below its historic peak of 3.7 million barrels per day in 1970, but still enough to shape pricing and supply dynamics. A small but strategically important portion, around 35,000 barrels per day, was flowing to Cuba under subsidized arrangements tied to security cooperation. That flow is now gone, completely. Trump's declaration was unambiguous. No more oil, no more money, no exceptions. Cuba's power grid, already strained, is now operating at the edge of failure, dependent on limited emergency supplies from Mexico and China. But Cuba's crisis is not the central story. The real story is what happens when Venezuelan oil is forcibly redirected. The Trump administration has made clear that Venezuelan oil flows are now being routed primarily toward American refineries. On paper, that sounds like a win for US energy security. In practice, it creates a cascading shortage elsewhere, particularly in Asia. China and India are the two countries most exposed. In 2023 alone, China imported roughly 144 million barrels of Venezuelan crude, accounting for more than two-thirds of Venezuela's total exports. India imported smaller volumes, but its heavy crude-optimized refineries still relied on Venezuelan supply to balance their feedstock. Those barrels are no longer available. Asian refiners now face an urgent problem. Their facilities are designed for heavy crude. Switching to lighter blends is expensive, inefficient, and in some cases technically impossible without major retrofits. They need a substitute, quickly. That is where Canada enters the picture. Canadian heavy crude from the Alberta oil sands is not a perfect match for Venezuelan oil, but it is close enough. More importantly, it is reliable. Production is stable, contracts are enforced, infrastructure works, and the oil exists today, not in some hypothetical post-recovery scenario. The key difference this time is access. For most of the past 30 years, Canada's oil exports were effectively landlocked. Even when Canada produced more oil than the United States could absorb, the bottleneck was always the same. Pipelines ran south, markets ran through America. That constraint is now gone. The Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion is operational. Canadian heavy crude can now move west at scale, reaching the Pacific coast and shipping directly to Asia. From there, tankers can reach China, India, Japan, and South Korea without touching US infrastructure. This changes everything. Canadian producers are already in active discussions with Asian refiners that previously depended on Venezuelan supply. These are not speculative conversations. They are about volumes, timelines, and multi-year commitments. Asian buyers are not looking for spot cargoes. They want stability. And stability is Canada's strongest asset. Over the past decade, Asian refiners have watched their major heavy crude suppliers fail one by one. Venezuela collapsed under mismanagement and sanctions. Russian exports became unpredictable after the Ukraine invasion. Middle Eastern supplies grew more vulnerable to regional conflict. Against that backdrop, Canadian oil looks almost boring, and boring is exactly what buyers want. But here is where the angle shifts. This is not just about Asia replacing Venezuela with Canada. It is about what happens when Canadian oil no longer needs the United States as a gatekeeper. For decades, US Gulf Coast refineries held leverage over Canadian producers. They were the primary buyers. They dictated terms. When Washington threatened tariffs or trade pressure, Canada had limited alternatives. That leverage is eroding. As Canadian producers secure Asian contracts, they gain pricing power, they gain optionality, and American refineries quietly lose their monopoly position. They will still buy Canadian crude. They have to. Their refineries are built for it, but they will no longer be the only game in town. Prime Minister Mark Carney understands this dynamic clearly. Since taking office, he has emphasized diversification not as a slogan, but as a structural necessity. Speaking from Paris just hours after Trump's Venezuela announcement, Carney highlighted Canada's competitive energy position and the importance of engaging non-American markets. India, which halted Venezuelan imports in 2025, has indicated it is actively seeking long-term heavy crude alternatives. Canada is at the top of that list. China, facing the loss of its largest heavy crude supplier, is exploring multi-year contracts with Canadian firms. This pattern is not theoretical. It already happened once. When Venezuelan production collapsed in the 2000s, US Gulf Coast refineries shifted to Canadian supply. Even when Venezuela partially recovered, those refineries stayed with Canada. The system worked, there was no incentive to change. Now the same process is playing out in Asia, and while Asian buyers secure stability, Canada quietly accumulates leverage. This is about more than oil revenues. It is about strategic positioning. Countries that depend on Canadian energy have incentives to maintain stable relations with Canada. That matters in trade negotiations, diplomatic alignments, and long-term partnerships. The infrastructure exists, the production exists, the political alignment exists, and Venezuela is not coming back quickly. Its infrastructure is decades old. Rebuilding will require tens of billions of dollars, years of work, and a level of political stability that does not yet exist. That gives Canada time, years, not months, to entrench itself as a primary heavy crude supplier to Asia while reducing its vulnerability to American pressure. This does not mean Canada abandons the US market. American refineries will continue buying Canadian oil. Geography alone guarantees that. But the relationship changes. Canada no longer negotiates from a position of dependence. That shift matters. When future trade disputes arise, Canada will have alternatives. When tariffs are threatened, Canada will have leverage. When Washington assumes compliance, Canada will have options. All of this is unfolding not because Canada acted aggressively, but because it prepared patiently. Trump wanted to demonstrate power. Instead, he exposed fragility in the global energy system. And Canada stepped into the gap, quietly, predictably, and with long-term consequences that will outlast this crisis.